Temperatures 11 degrees Celsius in the brighter spots.
In half an hour on BBC2, we join Harry Dodson to see what a typical April brings in the Victorian kitchen garden. Now, John Huntley dusts off the attic archives for the last time to bring us some rare and unique footage from the home front.
Hello and welcome to the last in the present series of Attic Archives. And in this programme, we're going to be looking at the days of the last war. Not at what was happening to the soldiers, but rather what was happening on the home front. It's very difficult for us at this distance in time to really imagine what it was like in the days of the Blitz, the winter of 1940 and 1941. And it's only occasionally that films come to light which give a more intimate picture. You see, the official newsreels aren't much good. They're mainly about the King and the Queen and Churchill and Montgomery. It's local records that make all the difference. For example, only recently a bit has turned up. It was found in an old air raid shelter in Bristol. It was on the old inflammable film. It's now been copied, and this is what it was all about. The sound in that piece, in fact, was added later in a BBC documentary programme at Bristol. Bristol is rather special. Because of the work of the Bristol Record Office and because of the work of one American, Andrew Fear, we have a unique record in colour which was made during 1940 and 1941. What happened was that Andrew Fear, an American whose folks originally came from Bristol, had come to this country in 1938 and then gone back to the States. And when he began to read in the newspapers about all the terrible things that were happening in this country, the days of the Blitz itself, the U-boats attacking the shipping, a terrible shortage of food, all sorts of stories were about in America in those days, he wrote to some friends of his who ran a photographic centre in Bristol. Now that was Dunscombe's. And they wrote back and said, yes, we'd love to make a record for you. We'd send you the film. I'm afraid it'll have to be in black and white. And he wrote back and said, no, sorry, I want it in colour. And they said, sorry, no colour film available in wartime Britain. So he arranged for the American Kodak company to send out a load of colour film stock. And this is what you're seeing here. This very special record, made in colour in the early days of the war, which really do give an idea of what, for ordinary everyday folk, air raids were all about. There were 3 states you existed in those days. White was all clear, purple, a warning, and then finally red. And that meant the sirens went off and everybody took cover. There were lots of these brick shelters in Bristol. As a matter of fact, there was a big row about them later on because it turned out they'd been badly built and the mortar had been incorrectly filled in between the bricks, and a lot of them fell apart. Here we see the wardens themselves and the sort of lives they led in those days. And when you heard that big sound, down you went. There was no inhibitions about it. People learned how simply to fall flat on their faces in the pavement in those days in front of everybody. You just had to get down when you heard the bombs. This was even more true when things like the V1s, the flying bombs, came over. The wardens were pretty smartly into action. They blew whistles normally, and then people in the surrounding houses would evacuate quickly. You notice they come pre-armed with their suitcases and their clothes. This was part of the procedure as well. This film, of course, is basically a reconstruction of the whole thing, made specially for film purposes. By the way, you can see a bit on the right-hand side there of the bad brickwork in some of these shelters. As a matter of fact, in Bristol, eventually, people actually abandoned these brick shelters, and they used 7 underground tunnels which existed in the caves in the Clifton Gorge. And so the air raid wardens went into action. The air raid wardens' posts were set up. It was from here, normally, that the air raid sirens were sounded, sometimes by the police. One of the key dangers in the early days was actually not so much high explosives. After all, you couldn't do much about the bombs, but something you could do something about was incendiary bombs. And so an enormous amount of the publicity in those days and the training was based on how to deal not with explosion, but with fire. You were armed with a stirrup pump. In those days, they cost 12 and 6pence each, and just a pail of water. And the point was that the fire bombs very often fell in extremely inaccessible places, on the roofs of buildings, and unless they were dealt with, of course, they burnt through into the building and you had a big fire on your hands. Now, you notice that the man who's going to operate the stirrup pump gets down on the ground. There are a number of reasons for this. First, in some ways, it was better to direct the water from below. Secondly, as the water hit the bomb, it was quite capable of blowing up in your face, really. And thirdly, in the latter days, the Germans actually began to put small explosive charges in the incendiary bombs to discourage action like that. Well, in a funny sort of way, that all makes it look a bit of a giggle, but I can assure you that in Bristol at that time, it was indeed no giggle. Bristol had more bombs than the famous city of Coventry. It was only because it was spread over a wider area in Bristol that it didn't make quite the same impact as the story of Coventry. And it was so bad between November 1940 and April 1941 that a lot of people used to leave the city every night and literally take to the hills. And despite all this, they could still run into trouble. This is a quite extraordinary record. This is just a single raider, a sneak raider as they call him here. It was actually a Huntley aircraft that came in and dropped 2 or 3 bombs at about 8:15 in the morning. It really was an absolute disaster because it fell right in the middle of the main shopping area. Nobody was expecting it. There was no air raid warning in operation at the time, and the casualties were simply tremendous. There were 3 buses lined up. They were all absolutely packed. People were busy opening up the shops and getting ready for the day's business, and then suddenly, absolutely out of the blue, total catastrophe. I met one of the men who was in one of these buses and who actually survived, but as he said, he only survived because he was totally surrounded when he came to. He said he didn't even hear an explosion. He just suddenly a moment of blankness. And when he did come to, he was absolutely surrounded by bodies which had in effect screened him from the blast and the shrapnel, and he was the only one left alive on board the bus. Another problem was that there were a great many basements in the Bristol under the shops, and this bomb had struck in the pavement, and as a result of this, even the cellars had collapsed, and so people were trapped underneath it. And what is so fascinating about this record is, first, it certainly wouldn't have been shown in wartime. No way would anything as dramatic as this have appeared on the screen. And secondly, most records of this kind, in fact, have been destroyed over the years as a result of official censorship. To see, I mean, that's a bus in the middle of that shop, but there's practically nothing left of it at all, even vaguely to recognize, except a pile of dark metal. The civil authorities in many of these regional cities were criticized at this time for being unprepared. And it was very often people like the Salvation Army and the Church Army and the YMCA who came to the rescue of those people who were involved, because the actual services themselves were strained so much to the limit that without the help of the volunteers, not much could have been done. Well, one of the things that the government ministries did do very well was issue leaflets, endless leaflets during the Second World War about keep it under your hat and don't talk to strangers, warnings of every conceivable kind, and even instructions as to what to do when you went to bed at night. telling you things like, for example, switching off the gas at the mains, dealing with water, making sure that you had a good bucket of water and sand ready, and make sure that you had your gas mask near. Fascinatingly, this piece of information was issued by, of all people, the Brewers Association. This scene was taken, in fact, in Aberdeen. It comes from the Alan Stott collection, and it shows gas masks in action. It's very difficult, again, at this distance in time, to realize how serious the gas threat appeared to people, particularly in the beginning of the Second World War. It was very much something left over from the days of the First World War, the terrors of the trenches, gas warfare, and so people took it very seriously indeed, and they carried their gas mask with them. We're back now, in fact, in Bristol. Probably the workers you see here were those that were drafted in to big factories, particularly like the giant aircraft plant at Filton near Bristol, and that's probably where these scenes were taken. Now, gas masks were carried all the time. That was the theory. It was no good if you didn't carry them all the time, and so they got bashed around a lot. They were in little wooden boxes which were not very strong. People carried them as shoulder straps, in effect, and so you had to constantly check them because there was wear and tear on them, even if you didn't have them on, because they got rattled around the boxes. And here, what's happening is, in fact, they are testing out the gas mask. All they're doing is simply closing up one end, and you took a deep breath, and if the air got through to you, you knew that the gas mask was faulty and you had a leak in it somewhere. These procedures were kept to pretty closely, certainly for the first couple of years, until it became clear that gas warfare was not going to happen, something that Hitler never indulged in at all, partly perhaps because it was too easy to retaliate. It even went to the extent of giving people a basic idea of what it would all be about if gas actually was dropped in the streets, and so you had these special tents where people went in and tested their gas masks properly. They're not actually using real poison gas, it's tear gas, something which, strangely and ironically, is very familiar to us these days on the newsreels almost every night. And if the gas mask wasn't working, you smelt the tear gas coming through it. One of the things that absolutely everybody remembers about the Second World War was ration books. And they were extremely important. Perhaps they've stuck in people's minds partly because they were one of the things that went on long after the war. 5 years after the Second World War, there was still, in fact, rationing in this country. And it was a fairly complicated process because the books had to be printed in vast numbers, of course, had to be issued, had to be fully documented, but it did give a certain sense of fairness, that things were being genuinely shared out during the war years. Now, part of the film that was made by Dunscombe's was, of course, for our American colleague, Mr. Fear, and he was very interested in all the newspaper reports that were appearing and were dominated very much in America by reports from Germany. They said that they really were strangling the British Isles, that the U-boats were cutting off the supply of food, and that there was tremendous poverty raging through the country. And so Dunscombe's film pays great attention to the whole business of rationing, of the issuing of the books, the process in which people received them, and to make it clear that something pretty fair was happening. People who were really desperate and who really needed things, cod liver oil, fruit juices, they were free. But for everybody else, it was a matter of your own personal ration book. And by the way, I should say that the men in the services, although of course they were fed in their depots and so on, they had a ration book. When they came on leave, they had to become the same as everybody else, and they just had a special page of the ration book to join in with the family. Now, the actual supply of food itself looks fairly generous in these films. You will see that there's all kinds of different foodstuffs on offer. And the point about it is that some is on ration and some isn't. I mustn't suggest that all you had was one sort of fixed ration and nothing else at all. Obviously, sort of things like bread and vegetables and so on were not on ration at all. This was rather an ingenious idea that was introduced in Bristol in the Blitz of restocking the windows by using a lot of boarding and just a small piece of glass in them. Well, here you see all the food, but the point about, of course, it is that although it's all there, national butter included, you could only get your rations worth of it. So the tendency of the shops, indeed, during the Second World War was to put on as good a display as they could. Wasn't just food, remember, it was clothes as well, footwear and the rest of it, and again, a spectacular display, but only available to you if you had the right coupons. Carrots, now that's a very fascinating business about seeing in the blackout. This was a story that's been launched for security reasons to suggest that the men of the RAF could see at night if they ate carrots. This was a security cover-up for the very recently introduced radar system. And there's the carrots again. Well, Steve, a great point made about carrots. One of the reasons, of course, was that carrots were fairly easy to grow, and so they were fairly common, and they were not on ration. These were the things that were on ration. It was the meat and the eggs and the bacon and things like that. And for that, you had to produce your book, and you only got a limited quantity each week of these rationed foods. There was, amazingly, a good supply of things like meat, because fairly rapidly we caught on to the fact that we had to produce our own food on a large scale, and there was a tremendous boost in cultivation. And there weren't many queues most of the time. This is a rather nice little gag that Dunscombe's introduced by showing this idea of a pet store. Watch when the camera pans up, it is in fact a dog shop, and you certainly had to queue to get your doggy meat. Now, what did this ration really mean? Well, here it is. This is 1 week of rationed foodstuffs per person. And these were the sort of things that went on ration. They were particularly things which contained sugar, like that syrup at the back there, and cheese, and even things like oats. I remember there's one singularly horrible thing. You couldn't always get the eggs. See the 2 eggs there? Well, if you didn't get your eggs, you had to make up with dried eggs, and they were quite horrible. They mixed up into a kind of awful coloured cotton wool that was almost inedible. This is rather intriguing too. All the streets had these pig bins. It's an interesting fact that in those days there was still a hangover from the 30s. And there were the working classes who lived a pretty poor life, and the middle classes who were much better off and had nicer homes. And in fact, the working class people at night used to pinch the food out of the pig bins for their own consumption. But most of it got to the piggies, and here they are. Sometimes people just had 2 or 3 pigs in their backyard in order to try and help the national effort. And this, of course, was bacon, and the bacon ration, and the part of the meat ration, the pork side of it, represented by these scenes. Watch closely here. You're going to get a chance in this forestry sequence to see an old steam traction engine still working. Now they're specially preserved vehicles, but there it's just doing an ordinary job. The forests were devastated during the Second World War. There was tremendous need for wood to make paper. It was used in ammunitions, and pit props. Pit props in the mines was a key thing. What's actually happening here is that they're not just giving the books to be sold or anything like that. The books are destined to go to the libraries. In case of a city like Bristol, particularly for the Navy, for each naval ship had on it its own special library for the men, and the books were given as a present. This is the University of Bristol. And here we come to something which was rather special, because once again, like the pig bins and so on, it gave a sense of total commitment to the War Office and the war work, and it gave a feeling that everybody was deeply involved. It was, in fact, a special War Office directive that railings should be removed and used for scrap metal to build aircraft and so on. And so it didn't matter whether they were the railings on your front garden, or whether they were on a great cathedral, or whether they were beautifully ornamented railings, as in the case here on the University of Bristol. By the way, they have since then been put back in this particular case. Off they went to the war effort. They weren't actually much good. This was the irony of the situation. The metal that came out of railings that had been rusting out in the open for years and years and years was almost useless, and a lot of it, in fact, was afterwards dumped in the sea and never used at all. But once again, the purpose of all this was to give this feeling of commitment, that we were all involved, we were all trying to help the war effort. Germany, ironically, took a long while to learn this lesson. It wasn't until 1944 that this same sense of commitment came into existence. It's funny how many bits of the Second World War are still lying around if you know where to look for them. Just coming in today here to the BBC studios at Aberdeen, on a relatively short walk, I passed about 6 houses. In the front gardens and on the front wall was still this little row of concrete-filled holes where the railings had once been. When you look at the films of the home front, it often looks as if everybody is having great fun. And that's particularly true of the army in training. I suppose it was a bit like the First World War, where the soldiers tended to forget about the death and destruction and thought more about new friends and comradeship And certainly during the Second World War, this kind of sense of just getting to know the people next door was a pretty important part of the morale of those days. The training films always have something of this atmosphere about it. Now, this actually is in Beech Grove Terrace at Aberdeen, not far from where we're making this programme. And the tram here, the idea is that the tram is on fire, perhaps hit by a bomb or even an incendiary. And so the lads on board, armed with smoke charges, are creating a tremendous sort of fire effect. In front of them is a Bren gun, and the lads of the Home Guard was actually a detachment with the BBC itself, who dash out into the street and have to deal with this situation. Crowd control, first of all, then protecting the basic situation, and then finally, with a Bren gun carrier, shoving the offending tram out of the way. This was a technique which was used quite a lot during the Blitz days to clear the streets as quickly as possible to allow the emergency services to get through. This is something entirely different. This is the days of the Territorials, and it's a group in training. It's actually near Plymouth in the West Country. I'm always fascinated by the fact that people still thought that horses were going to play a major role in the Second World War. When you consider that the basic battles were fought by Spitfires and Hurricanes at about 400 miles an hour, how people thought that horses were going to be really important, I can't imagine. These horses actually have just been brought in from local farms, requisitioned by the army to take part in this particular exercise. Cavalry charges, in fact, did happen. They happened in the First World War, actually under aircraft charging together. And we remember, too, that in the early days of the Second World War, the Polish cavalry charged pathetically and rather magnificently against Bren gun carriers. But the horse remained a key part of training all the way through, certainly in the 1930s. Now we're back with the Dunscombe collection. This is on Bristol Downs. This time, it's the turn of the Home Guard. Well, this was indeed a world in which friendships counted. This was Dad's army, for real this time. Primitive equipment in many cases, but great sense of dedication, great sense of involvement in what you were trying to do. Now we come to the Royal Artillery, and in this case, once again, a training scene taken in the 1930s. This particular group trained in the Scottish hills, around places like Dunfermline, and indeed on the outskirts of Edinburgh. The old transport is still there, looking still very much like the First World War, that great six-wheeler there. Although, in fact, it's based on the design which was used for buses in the 1930s. And again, too, this sense of excitement, perhaps, and a great sort of Sunday outing. These are the Brackeneers. These were deprived lads led by a piper who stormed out into the hills to cut down the bracken. This was a key part of the war effort because it was necessary to clear every single bit of land you could for cultivation. Remember those ration books that we saw earlier on? And it's shot in a rather fascinating way because it's been documented as if it was one of those great Russian documentary films directed by Eisenstein with workers against the sky and the clouds. Part of the home war effort. Well, certainly during the Second World War, people got a chance to do all sorts of jobs which they would never have dreamed of doing otherwise. And of course, for many people, it changed their lives really forever. There was one moment, I suppose, when everybody came together in unison, and that was the all clear. When at the end of an air raid, you would suddenly hear coming from the warden's post, sometimes from the local police station, the sound, the single penetrating sound of the all clear signal from the siren above. And out of the shelters, people would come, not looking quite as fresh as this, I should perhaps say normally, because they probably had a pretty rotten night, were very happy to get home, and everybody could take a breather and relax for a moment as the all clear sounded. Raiders passed, and the white disc went up in the warden's post, and it seemed as if it was all over for now. But of course, for many people, it was a very different story indeed. Out they came from their shelter during the night to find this, possibly their own home that had been destroyed during the night. It's strange because people were sometimes so terrified that they would literally stay in these little dugouts, they were called Anderson shelters, in their own garden until daylight came, almost afraid at what they might find. And then when they finally plucked up courage to come out, so often they found that their own house had been destroyed, but at least they were still there, they were still alive. It was the same story too for people coming out of the brick shelters in the streets, that they would emerge to find absolute chaos around them, and possibly their own houses destroyed as well. Indeed, towards the end of the war, people fatalistically stayed in their own houses during a raid, simply took a chance on whether it was struck down or not, rather than the fear of coming out and finding this. For some people, it wasn't all over by a long way. This was one moment when, however brave you were, you had to leave your house. And that was when, in searching around, daylight came, these holes in the ground where bombs had gone in and had not exploded. So now everybody in the area had to be immediately evacuated. And what I always think of, in fact, as the real heroes of the Second World War were these men who dealt with unexploded bombs. Now, this wasn't the exhilaration of a magic moment of a Spitfire shooting down a Messerschmitt. This was just living really with death, morning, noon, and night. Because down there is an unexploded bomb. Now, it's maybe, of course, that it's a dud, but it's also perfectly possible that it's actually timed not to go off, that it's got a device in it which will set it off 12, 18, 24, 5 days. And there it is, the actual bomb itself. Now, that's incredibly rare, that shot, because the official newsreel cameramen of the day, their lives were considered too valuable to risk on shots like that, and they were actually prohibited from taking scenes of unexploded bombs. Perhaps our cameraman from Dunscombe's in Bristol got to know the lads of the bomb disposal unit over a cup of tea, that universal symbol when things got really hot and difficult. The answer to it was, let's make a cup of tea. And it was the same for the bomb disposal boys as it was for everybody else. And so finally to the end. Well, partly the end. This is Victory in Europe Day. And in Bristol, they've got out the coronation coach with the Lord Mayor. The Americans are still there in force. Bristol, in fact, was one of the main centres of the American troops during the Second World War, and they joined with our own forces and civilians in celebrating the end of the war in Europe. That at least meant the end of bombing raids and so on. But of course, the war was still on in Japan. There was still a lot of lives to be lost, still a lot of fighting to be done. But it was an occasion for at least a brief celebration before the war in the Pacific resumed. And so with the American troops and the little flags being waved, and in the midst of the wreckage of their own city, the war in Europe had finally come to an end. Well, it all happened about 40 years ago, and I suppose if it wasn't for these wonderful films, it would all just be a rather faint memory. This is the last of this present series of Attic Archives, but we hope to present some more programs later on, and if you've got any film which relates to 1920s or 30s, or even the war years for that matter, please do let us know. Now, don't send us the film at the moment, but just let us have a note here at Attic Archives, BBC, Beech Grove Terrace, Aberdeen, AB9, 2ZT. Now, I'll give you that just once more. It's Attic Archives, BBC, Beech Grove Terrace, Aberdeen, AB9, 2ZT. We're going to end this program, very appropriately perhaps, with a surrender. It's the surrender of a German U-boat which sails into Bristol Harbour as a rather special symbol for an area associated with shipping and the docks of the end of the Second World War. From me, goodbye.
35 minutes here on 2. Steve.